we go back to a city 100 years ago, 50 years ago even, there was a wider range of housing choices for new arrivals. Some were in beautiful, fancy, massively expensive spots. Some were much smaller. And what he talked about, among other things, was the role that minimum square footage causes in keeping prices high. And not just that you can't have as many units, but also the fact that an option that a really poor person might want, which is an inexpensive, small, what we might call a hovel, to be really blunt about it. People might be willing to live in a hovel, meaning a tiny, small place, because they really care about that location. They want to be in Midtown Manhattan, or they want to be in downtown D.C. or off at DuPont Circle, and they're not allowed to by law. So, we've talked about some of the range of hearings and other things, but there are these specific things that they are black and white. They're not discretionary, but they have a very bad effect, I think, on the scope and breadth of housing choices that people can make. Talk about that.
Yeah, there's a whole range of things that are basically just illegal to build at this point. Most cities, and even central cities, big places, New York, San Francisco, D.C., have just outlawed multifamily building on 2/3 to 3/4 of their land. So you just can't build apartments, period. It's not just the zoning code. We've also got things built into, for instance, building codes. So I've been doing some research recently on kind of the demise of boarding houses. The idea that you used to be able to have essentially, like a large single family house, but you could turn that into a boarding house. There was one kitchen for the house, and so the landlord would provide meals for tenants at certain times. But you didn't have the idea that every single dwelling unit needed to have a freestanding kitchen and bathroom. You probably had 1 or 2 bathrooms that everybody shared. You had one kitchen that tenants didn't even have access to, and people just rented a room. That was all you needed, was a space. And we've seen the iterations. This used to be sort of kind of working class or even middle class phenomenon in big cities. Then boarding houses turned into SROs, which were a very cheap option.
Which stands for?
Single room occupancy.
Uh-huh.
So essentially that you would just rent a room in a house to sleep in, and you also didn't have to have a long-term lease. So for poor people, coming up with a month's advance rent for a security deposit is a lot of money if you have to pay for a full year. But being able to rent a room for a week or a month at a time is something that's more affordable. We no longer have any of these cheap options. So small units, fitting a lot of units onto one piece of land, things that are not a complete housing unit with kitchen and bath, shorter term leases, all of these options that we used to have where poor people could find a place to live that wasn't their car or the sidewalk, we've basically made those all illegal.
And when I talk about this, we talked in that Berto episode about Chelsea neighborhood, New York, which is a really beautiful neighborhood, really low buildings, and some of the most expensive real estate in the world. And it gives it a certain nice look and feel. And his reaction, and I was saying, people like walking around there. And he said, yeah, but it means poor people can't live there. And when I told someone else, that their reaction was, well, they don't like poor people, Talk about some of the roots of zoning and land use restriction that were driven by racism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the zoning sort of became a bigger part of the U.S. Most local governments adopted it either in kind of the teens and the 20s, and then there was another wave after World War II. But a lot of current zoning was explicitly racist. So when you couldn't have racially restrictive covenants, you instead adopted zoning that required new houses to be large and expensive. If you can't legally discriminate by race, you can discriminate based on income, and that's still okay. And so that's what a lot of places do now.
Okay, meaning legally okay, but
legally
not really okay, because it was really designed to keep out poorer people who happen to be black.
It's not ethically okay, but it's legal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what a lot of places do now, is they write these zoning rules and building codes that mean that new housing is going to have to be very expensive. Snooty white suburbs are fine with black people moving in as long as they're a CEO and can buy a $2 million house. But nobody gets to move in unless they can afford a $2 million house.
Of course, there's a side effect of that, which is that if the best schools or even only the decent schools are in those neighborhoods, poor people are priced out of that. And it makes it a lot harder for their children to rise. I find it deeply distressing, and I wish we could do something about it. But let's put that aside for the moment. Now, the boarding house phenomenon, I just want to say as a footnote that in 1976, I think it was 76, I lived here in D.C. in Hartnett Hall. Maybe some listeners there have either walked by Hartnett Hall or have stayed there perhaps. It was just a block or so off of DuPont Circle. It's been since gentrified, turned into a really nice set of offices. But in those days, it was a boarding house. I got a bedroom. That was it. No access to kitchen. I got wonderful access. I was on the first floor, so I could hear the sirens going all night when D.C. was a less safe place. And when my dad came to visit, and he said, well, this isn't so bad. I said, Dad, that's a cockroach on the bed. And remember, I didn't have a kitchen or any food in there. It was, I wouldn't say it was a hovel, but it wasn't fancy. It wasn't nice. But I was 22 years old, and it was
what
great.
Was your rent?
I loved it. I don't remember. I want to say $75, but that's just the first number that comes into my head. So similar to the minimum size thing, banning boarding houses, SROs, single room occupancy, is going to effectively not just lower the total number of units available in the area, meaning higher rents, it's closing off an entire part of the market that is, quote, lower quality, but it's a quality that a lot of people are very eager to pay for because they can't afford anything else and they'd like to be in that location.